Welcome, my lords, to the White City, where you will learn more about Middle-earth and discover differences and similarities between the Rings of Power show and Tolkien's books, and whether Amazon's show, episode by episode, is worth watching. I'm Philip Dutt, your host, and I'll be joined by Matt Vandervoort and Mark Schaefer. I hope you enjoy. I think it's a good point to turn to leadership. And I think like in some of our notes combined, kind of just talking about good leaders compared to like evil leaders or just bad leaders. And yeah, it's just interesting to see who the good leaders are and like betrayed in the books as opposed to the Rings of Power. And I think there are some good points that we can make, but Mark, do you have any? I think most of the stuff was some of your comments, but
Yeah. So I had this interesting thought that I feels like in the original Lord of the Rings books that most of the leaders are good. I know that's like a pretty crazy claim, but like if you think about it, like there's Elrond's a leader, Galadriel's a leader, but even like the leaders of men, whereas like Eric and Brand is like sort of an important leader in the books, but you think of like even Éomer and Theoden, while like sort of corrupted by Saruman, like becomes very good, like a very strong leader, leads his people rightly. And whereas think of like Denethor is also sort of corrupted, he still has elements of like goodness to him, and then Faramir is like a good leader. So like, there's a lot of leaders that are portrayed as like really good and really like someone worth following. In the more recent show, it feels like they've sort of shifted away from that. Like a lot of the leaders seem very shifty. It was just most notably to me was like he's not a huge character, but Gil-galad, which like nothing bad about him in the books, but they like made him seem very like shifty. He's sort of playing this political game. He's asking Elrond to lie and send him there to spy and stuff to the Khazad-dûm. And yeah, it seems like this like maybe mistrust of authority has like sort of been sneaked into the story. Thinking also of like, I mean, obviously in the books too, Earth is very corrupt, but also like some of the things going on in the other storylines also seem like maybe the leaders should not be trusted. I thought that was sort of interesting, and was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on that.
Well, I will say I think that there are examples of good leadership in the show. Like, I think the leader of the Harfoots is kind of portrayed as like, oh, he sort of doesn't believe her at first, but then eventually comes around and realizes that like, oh yeah, she's being real, and these are good things to do. Um, yeah, Gil-galad is sort of like he is a little bit more conniving and political in the show. I will say I think that part of it is just there's not much in the books from the source material that they're working with about their like leadership styles. Um, so they're kind of having to come up with the characters on their own, and like from a purely storytelling perspective, like it's kind of not interesting for like this kind of dramatic TV show if like, oh, all the leaders are great. Now, obviously, like Lord of the Rings, great story. Most of the leaders are looked up to and respectful, but I also think again it comes down to a difference in storytelling style. In that the leaders, because it's not character driven, the leaders don't have to be bad in the Lord of the Rings. They can just be upstanding great leaders. Whereas in this more like person character driven show, like if all of the good guys are all in accord with what to do, they can't really tell the story the way that they want to tell the story. And let's face it, in this sort of age of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon and all those sorts of things, like people are kind of interested in the political stuff, and the clash between a character's personal ideals and what the authority over them is telling them to do. Um, so I think that that's part of the reason they're writing the characters this way, is just that that's what sells, to be completely honest. But yeah, I do think that they're sort of shifting it that way. I will say the one place that I think it works the best is with the dwarves, because the dwarves have traditionally been portrayed as like stubborn and like loyal to their friends to a fault and all these sorts of things, that having the dwarves butt heads over stuff makes a lot of sense to me. Um, I mean, you even in the Hobbit, you have Thorin kind of going crazy, and Bilbo, because he's not a dwarf, decides to do the thing that actually makes sense. Whereas a lot of the other dwarves are like, yeah, no, we kind of agree with Bilbo, but we swore this loyalty to Thorin, and so I guess we're just here now.
Yeah, I was gonna say like I think you're absolutely right. The dwarves I thought were portrayed really well. The reason I sort of hit on Gil-galad is that like you think of like in the Lord of the Rings books where you have like Galadriel, Celeborn,
Yeah,
Elrond, even like Círdan or Círdan, I don't know how you say it.
yeah.
But even if you think of like the Silmarillion, where like yeah, sure, Faramir was like a complete jerk and stuff, but like literally every other elf leader was like a pretty upstanding guy. Like if you think of like the High King of the Elves, like Turgon, Fingolfin, like Finarfin for a while, like all of them were like pretty upstanding, and therefore like it was sort of this really interesting choice of like Gil-galad, like who sort of seems to fill more of a Elrond or Galadriel role in the show, was like chosen to make him, hey, let's like sort of undermine or like make him seem more shifty and play the political intrigue game.
I do want to push
Um,
back on that a little bit. Um,
Sounds good. Go for it.
because for one thing, part of the whole deal of the Silmarillion is that the elves fail because of infighting. Like that's part of the whole doom of Mandos is like
Hmm.
your a lot of your problems will come from within yourselves. Um, and I think that a lot of the elf leaders, they're good, but they're all flawed in certain ways. Like Turgon, yeah, he does found Gondolin at the behest of Ulmo, but I think you could kind of read it as like, yeah, he's the High King of the Elves, and he's just disappeared. He's just not engaging with his people in a lot of ways for a long period of time. You have Thingol, who like doesn't really care about the fight that much. He kind of, whenever he has to get involved, he sort of has to be coerced into doing it. And then there's the mistreatment of like the petty dwarves and the like they don't pay some dwarves. I think at some point Nargothrond was like a dwarven hall before um uh Fingolfin, Finarfin, whoever it is,
I think it's Fingen, I want to say.
Fingen. Yeah, that sounds right. Before he shows up,
I know they all sound the
they
same
all
though.
sound the same. It's been so long. But
Uh,
no, it's Finrod. It's Finrod Felagund. That's
Finrod,
why.
that's right.
Um,
Yeah.
uh, before he shows up, and then he basically kicks the dwarves out of Nargothrond. Um, and then eventually Nargothrond falls because of their arrogance. And then there's the whole everything that's going on with the Sons of Feanor, where they're all like jerks, and like some of them are jerks and some of them are good people, but they're like, we swore to get the Silmarils, so I guess we're gonna have to kill you. Um, so like,
Oh yeah. I'm not saying like all the like obviously the Sons of Feanor, but they're like I was more thinking of like the High King of the Elves because it's
yeah,
literally the title Gil-galad holds.
yeah.
I will say like Turgon, like the people who hid away and didn't fight, like they were never meant to be like no one. They could never beat Morgoth, right? They were never
Yeah.
meant to beat
No, no,
Morgoth.
no, no, no.
So them
They
hiding
couldn't.
was actually the right thing to do, and a lot of the times, whenever they did choose to fight, it was like actually the wrong thing to do. So I don't think that, like so they're
That's
hiding away is like a
that
moral
is fair. That's fair.
flaw. So I think
Um,
there's like a star next to a lot of those. Obviously, like yes, there are flawed elf characters, just like High King of the Elves is like pretty much always a stand-up guy in the Silmarillion.
yeah. I mean, I think for the most part, that's really accurate. Although, well, I don't know. I was gonna say, you have Turgon kind of turning Huron away at the end, but that ended up not working out either. Um,
Well, he was being followed too, so
yeah,
they
he
would
was.
have
That's what I was gonna say. Huron was being followed, so it kind of
and that actually is how they end up
yeah.
catching Maeglin in
So
the end.
that was
and
sort of
yeah.
the right thing to do. Although Not that he would have had this knowledge, but it wouldn't have mattered either way if he took him in or not. For the most part, I think that's probably a valid critique with specifically talking about the High King of the Elves. But again, I think that if you look at the elves as a whole, he's not necessarily acting out of character of how elves would have acted. And, I think that one of the more interesting things in sort of a long term historical ish drama kind of story is that, like, oh, different kings have different personalities, and some of them are going to be great, upstanding people, and some of them are going to be, shifty jerks. I don't
But
know.
like Gil-galad ends up like befriending Elendil in the end, and right going to fight Sauron. So
Yeah.
this is eventually a guy who's going to be a good
Oh,
character
yeah.
and like somebody who's a hero and whatever I want to root for in the show. So I think that was like almost it seemed almost intentional of like, hey, we don't want this guy to become too much of a focus, and we want to
Yeah.
focus the show on other things.
I mean, again,
Um,
in a practical sense, in a book, in a sort of historical narrative book, you can focus on way more people. I think also that they might be setting him up for a character arc, honestly. Like,
hmm.
he's not really listening to reason at the moment, but eventually he'll sort of come around and end up, because he ends up dying with the spear.
There was that
That
point,
Ridiculous.
though, right at the last episode where Elrond comes to Gil-galad and tells him, repeats to him the words that he said about hope, right? Gotta go back to that. So I guess that kind of is a
leadership and hope, it all comes together.
yeah, that's kind of is
Yeah.
a character arc for him at that moment. To me,
Yeah.
it was like a showing point of like, okay, I feel like he's gonna be somebody who's gonna have a change of heart about a lot of things.
Yeah.
He also
Um,
is skeptical about the rings of power, right? Which shows he has some sort of
Good
wisdom
character
or something
development.
to, yeah.
Man, I sure hope they show the rest of the forgings, but I kind of doubt it.
Yeah, that'd be a super big bummer if they don't. But
I do want to see. This is very off topic, but I do really want to see how they portray the forging of the One Ring. I think that'll be pretty cool.
yeah. The other thing I put with the leadership thing is, so I thought of like four people who are sort of like leaders in the show Rings of Power. This is sort of a spicy question, but like of the four of them, you have like the one Hobbit leader, you have Bronwyn, you have Muriel, and you have Galadriel, and three of those four are like female characters. And is this show maybe trying to like sort of push an agenda of like, hey, female leadership is just as good, if not better, than male leadership, or are we reading too much into that?
yeah,
I don't
so
know. I feel
that's
like you might. Well, I was gonna say I feel like I might be reading too much into it, mostly because of those three characters, two of them are leaders in uh, Tolkien's works themselves. So Galadriel is like portrayed as basically, the most powerful individual outside of like Sauron in Middle Earth, even potentially until Gandalf comes back as Gandalf the White. Galadriel is more powerful than he is, and even up to that point, she might be. And then Muriel is portrayed as the last good ruler of Numenor before Ar-Pharazôn takes over. The girl from the Southlands, Brionwen?
Bronwyn.
Bronwyn.
Bronwyn? Yeah. Um, the one issue that I would take with that is just from a historical standpoint, it might not make the most sense to have her be like the leader of the village, but also like it's not unheard of. So it's not I don't think that's unrealistic. I don't really see that much of an agenda in it. Um that's just my personal take on it.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people, especially big fans, who I guess they're just not all about the woke thing, which is interesting. But they think the show's woke, and the only thing that I could see the show being woke for is, the possible feminism with the female leaders. But at that same time, just thinking about the way that it's been portrayed in other ways, in film, media, whatever, that the women have definitely been more of like, oh, like, kick butt, like, I can do anything, nobody can stop me, kind of a thing. And I'm not saying that's like, they're kind of doing that with Galadriel, but at the same time, it's not like so in my face, especially with the other two female characters, that I would say, like, okay, there's a huge woke agenda here. But I think that people who are who are really strict fans. I mean, they probably just don't like the addition of different races in because Tolkien's world would be a medieval, like
Yeah.
Western European world, which okay, but at the same time, like for me, that's not a big issue, but for them, they're calling it woke for those reasons, which are a little more particular.
Yeah. I think also it can get a little bit into the realm of they don't really like the show anyways, and so they're just kind of
Yeah.
looking for reasons to nitpick it and not like it, and it's like that's kind of weak. Like it's just like if you don't like the show, just say you don't like the show. You don't need to make up a reason to justify it. Like I don't know.
I got you. That's for other things that I've like posted online and whatnot that people have had a quibble with about the show, and it's like, come on, man, like you're
Yeah.
like wait, the other they think they're making a big deal of it because they don't like the show, and it's
Yeah.
also interesting. Just on a side note here, real fast, is that some of these people actually sound like they've watched the thing the whole way through,
Oh
which is
yeah.
very interesting to me. I'm like, okay, if you didn't like it, why did you keep watching it? But I feel like they had like this
Man.
sense of like, as a fan, they'd have to like watch it to see how it like turns out, um, in that
What
way.
they
But
don't
yeah,
realize is that the studios don't care if you like it. They just care if you watched it. So if you're watching it just to hate it, that's not going to stop them from doing what they're doing. If you actually have an issue
uh,
with anything, which for the record, I don't really have an issue with anything they've done in the show. So it's like yeah.
Yeah. I think it's yeah. You guys have made some really good points. The one thing I will say is like you're absolutely right to Matt's point that like Galadriel and Muriel are both portrayed as good characters in the books, but so is Gil-galad, and it seems like they almost intentionally sort of shifted away. Obviously, like you guys both said, I agree. They're like I've definitely watched things that feel more like they have an agenda to them. This show has done a good job of portraying all characters of all types. I will say the one thing is it does sort of feel like, at least with the character of Galadriel, that like okay, here's a woman who's stronger than all the dudes and, is just sort of like, right, this super martial artist person that overcomes all her obstacles very easily. And
I would
that sort of is like, I don't know. We've had this discussion
yeah,
before, and I've
I
we've
would
seen.
touched
also,
on
like,
this many times.
I would also
Yep,
like
and
to
we
point
will,
out
but
that if they're trying to make Galadriel be like, yeah, girl boss, it's like they're writing her as a very mannish girl. And it's like I know like I have friends who are very much like feminists and stuff like that, and one of the critiques they would probably have of this is that like they're not writing her like a strong female character. They're writing her like a strong male character. And so if their goal with her is to make her a strong female character, they're not really succeeding because
yeah,
they're just writing her as what a guy thinks a strong female character would be like, which isn't really a successful tactic if you're trying to do that sort of thing. So,
yeah. That's a really good point, and like other shows have like sort of done that, but that like yeah, I think especially like some qualities she has that like you see how ambitious she is and how driven she is to excluding other people is almost seen like a positive quality in a strong female leader, but like in any male leader that would be seen as an incredibly negative quality, right? Of someone we'd instantly super dislike him, which is really interesting, I think, and they have sort of portrayed Galadriel that way, at least in the first few
yeah.
episodes they did,
Yeah.
which is interesting.
I don't know. I think I was just going to kind of going back to I think people are just looking at it to dislike it. I think part of that just comes down to the fact that it's a Lord of the Rings thing that doesn't feel super Lord of the Ringsy. Like personally, if this wasn't a Lord of the Rings show, one, to be fair, I probably wouldn't watch it because I don't watch a lot of TV. Um, but if I was watching it and it was just a standalone fantasy thing, I think it would be fine. Like, I think I would enjoy it. Um, but I think and I think it would do reasonably well. Probably not enough to justify being the most expensive TV show ever made, but um, I think that in another universe where it's the exact same plot lines, it's just its own thing. I don't think there'd be nearly as many people complaining about it because there wouldn't be nearly as many people that would care. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, to be fair, though, like, I mean, I think this is a really interesting question. I think, especially not just this universe, but a lot of other universes. You think of Star Wars, Harry Potter. Everybody seems to be like writing sequels to sequels at this point.
Oh yeah.
Marvel too.
No, I've gone over
Um,
that. I've gone over that point where like I think uh there's a lot of shows and stuff that have happened recently where like one side will be like, "Oh, it's too woke," and the other side will be like, "Oh, it's not woke enough," and I'm just in the middle like, "It's not original enough. Just make your own shows, please."
Yeah, I
Like,
think, but to your point that like I think as a fan of like these universes, like if you like write a decent story but you put it in a universe I love, I have a right to hold you to a higher standard for putting in a universe I
yeah,
love. Like,
I think
sure, if
that's
you write
fair.
a decent fantasy story and don't set in Lord of the Rings, I'll give you more slack. But if you set in Lord of the Rings and are like putting like inspired by J.R.R. Tolkien, like my favorite author, underneath it, like I'm gonna hold you to a higher standard and like
Yeah,
yeah, I'm gonna jump on the little flaws and it, like I don't know, like and that's I think maybe what it comes down to is that like yeah, like if it wasn't a Lord of the Rings show, I might think it was a really good show, but like because it is, I'm like it's like sort of okay.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, really quick before like I don't know, I really did want to ask. What is your guys' opinion of the biggest change from the original Lord of the Rings movies to the original Lord of the Rings books?
Dude, whenever I read the Lord of the Rings books for the first time, I was just like eye opened, and this is completely against what you're opposite what you're saying, but like I'm like, what? It's like every other line is the same thing. I'm flipping, reading. I'm like, this scene with Frodo and Gandalf in Mines of Moria is copy and paste. So I was surprised at that, but um, I think. I think that I liked the Boromir dying at the end of the Fellowship better than him dying at the beginning of the Two Towers book.
Mm.
But yeah.
Getting rid of Tom Bombadil? No, not actually.
Oh
Um,
no,
uh, I
actually
I wish that in the extended edition, not even as part of the extended edition, I wish in like the bonus features they would have added a whole thing about Tom Bombadil. Um, but no, I
Wait,
understand why they got rid of Tom Bombadil. Uh, I think honestly it is some of the characterization. So, and this is totally ripping off like a YouTube video I watched a few months ago.
Nerd of the
But
Rings.
yeah, I think it was Nerd of the Rings. Uh, but like we went over with Aragorn being less confident up until right towards the end, and uh, Gimli being the comic relief and not sort of a more serious character. Um, I think those are, uh, I think those two things are probably like the characterization of those things are probably my biggest gripes with um, the movies over the books is that like the characterization of certain characters changed. But again, like you're changing the medium and there's certain things that you have to do to get it to all work out. And I think they probably made the sacrifices that they could. And I mean, I still really enjoy the movies, obviously. They're really good. But I think that, yeah, those are probably my biggest gripes is that they, that. Or that they made the Hobbit trilogy. That might be my biggest gripe with the movies.
yeah, that one was not super great, but I think you're right that like you can still enjoy a great movie
Oh,
and
yeah.
like even if it's not perfect. But I will say that mine is actually very specific in that the book when Gollum bites the ring off Frodo's finger, he falls in on his own. And in the movies, Frodo
Mm,
wrestles him in. And I actually
Hmm.
think that's really important for how Tolkien wrote the story where,
yeah.
you know, Frodo fails in the end. He doesn't do anything. And it's sort of like, um, but in the movie, he sort of succeeds because he wrestles Gollum into the lava.
Yeah.
I think just to like get back to the way Tolkien writes his story, you know, Tolkien actually, it's interesting because like I think actually like there's like a Christ analogy in this like Gollum character where like you know nobody could destroy the ring on their own. Nobody could have walked Mount
Yeah.
Doom, and so they need a higher power to provide a sacrificial lamb, and like Gollum is that sacrificial lamb that's like sacrificed because
That's
nobody else
funny.
could do it, and sort of
That's
like,
interesting.
yeah, I think it's really really interesting. Was just something I thought about. But yeah, that's like I think one of the biggest change because it's like the whole climax of the entire
Yeah.
series.
The other
Um,
change that it falls into it falls in the same category as Tom Bombadil, is the Scourging of the Shire.
Oh
Because
yes. No,
the
I
Scourging of
actually
the
would have. I
Shire,
would have liked to see that.
I was going to say, the Scourging of the Shire, the reason it's there, and they do make reference to it in the Pool of Galadriel, because they knew that that was when they're going to have to cover it. But the reason it's important is because it shows that this war has reached every part of Middle Earth, and it's affected everybody, even the people you wouldn't think that would have affected it. So it's an important part of the story. However, from a movie making perspective, I know why they had to cut it, because it doesn't make any sense to introduce an entirely new plot after the climax of your story. Um,
Yeah.
and also, they'd already killed Saruman, which they probably did because they weren't going to do the Scourging of the Shire anyways, but,
Sorry, really quick. The other really important thing with the Scourging of Shire is it shows the hobbits' character growth. That they're the
Yes.
ones who save the Shire in the end, and they can do it because they've been through all these terrible things and learned all these lessons from the rest of the book.
And it shows that Frodo is the most affected of all of them, because it's finally the period where his involvement in the plot finally kind of matches his importance to the plot, because like Frodo, like a lot of his struggle is internal. And because of the way the story is written, you don't get a ton of that. You get a lot of it, but you don't get as much. Like, the perspective of me in high school when I was reading it, or middle school when I was reading it, Frodo was probably the least interesting hobbit. Because it's just like, yeah, he's getting affected by the ring, and I see how that's a deep and wonderful thing, but it's just like, it's just not interesting when his friends are off fighting Nazgul and stuff. But he finally, deservedly, kind of can take the focus gets taken off of him, while at the same time it emphasizes how exhausted and how affected by the journey he was over his friends, to the point that he's the one who's like staying their hand and keeping them from going down the dark path in the end. And so yeah, I really would have. That's another thing where it's like, if they had done like a short film and added it into the like special features or something, that would have been great. That would have been the best way to handle it. Just be like, if you really want to watch the whole thing, just slot this in between returning to the Shire and going to the Grey Havens. And like, they could have done the same thing with Tom Bombadil. Like, just slot this scene in between them leaving the Shire and making it to Bree. So I really wish, because I would have loved to have seen those actors do those parts, but c'est la vie.
Thanks for visiting the White City. Before you leave, please subscribe to our podcast and check us out at thewhitecitypodcast.com. Consider supporting my movement on Facebook, keeping the rings of power pure.